Listen carefully. You were never meant to hear this. In the sealed archives of Wisconsin's oldest diocese lies a bundle of papers wrapped in black cloth and marked nullius memoria. No memory. They are not supposed to exist, yet they do, describing 23 women who walked into a convent and were never seen again. The Catholic hierarchy called it clerical confusion. Historians whispered administrative loss. But the truth is older, colder, and infinitely darker. For more than a century and a half, someone has been erasing the Sisters of St. Mary's from the world, one by one, and burying the evidence in walls, in rivers, and in the minds of men who dared to ask why. You can still smell the cold limestone when you read the first page. 1854. A massive mansion purchased under the church's expansion plan, 3 wings of Gothic stone and shadow squatting over 30 acres of woodland. Locals saw the nuns arrive in black habits, Irish accents, eyes shining with missionary zeal. They thought they were seeing holy women. They were seeing recruits. The bishop's speech about mercy and orphan care concealed a deeper purpose, a test site for obedience, ritual, and psychological control far from the eyes of Europe. Inside, the architecture itself became a weapon, long corridors designed to distort footsteps, confessionals where whispers vanished like steam, the chapel windows narrow enough to resemble keyholes, and beneath the chapel floor, an older foundation, sealed stairways, and iron rings sunk into stone where no orphan or sister was ever meant to go. Mother Superior Catherine Murphy, a woman whose pale blue eyes could slice through pretense like razors, had been chosen for this wilderness precisely because of her unflinching discipline. Those who doubted her authority were broken gently at first, then brutally, until they stopped doubting at all. Imagine arriving as a young nun, 20 years old alone, and believing you were giving your life to God, only to discover your life had been requisitioned for something else. Something older than Rome, older than the cross itself. St. Mary's was not just a convent. It was a crucible. And the first night you slept there, you would feel it in your bones, a silent hum under the stone, like the breath of a predator waiting beneath the floorboards. You're standing at the threshold of St. Mary's now, the oak doors closing behind you like a verdict. The smell of candle wax and wet stone hangs in the air. You hear the bell tower toll 3 slow notes, each reverberating in your chest, as if the building itself is taking your heartbeat hostage. This is how they began the conditioning, rhythm, ritual, and deprivation. Every system of control in history begins with rhythm clocks, bells, chants, drills. What you call devotion is really entrainment. Once your mind moves to someone else's metronome, your will becomes malleable. Inside, the day is divided into strict quadrants: prayer at 3, labor at 5, silence at 6, obedience at all hours. The young nuns rise from wooden cots in a dormitory lined like barracks. They kneel on stone floors until their knees numb, whispering Latin they barely understand, eyes fixed on flickering candles, as if the flame might answer back. This was not only about worship. It was about erasure. Each act stripped them of their former selves, weakening their identity until only one voice remained, Mother Catherine's. And she wielded that voice like a blade. She read their letters before sealing them. She assigned punishments under the guise of penance. She controlled food, heat, and even sunlight. Shutters were opened or closed at her word. She selected who could tend the orphanage, who could work the infirmary, who would be sent on mysterious errands. Over time, the younger sisters stopped speaking in anything but whispers, their accents fading, their personalities dissolving into one gray mass of service. But even inside this machine of control, signs of the forbidden blood through. There were nights when the bells tolled at hours not on the schedule. Lights seen flickering below the chapel floor, whispered rumors that certain sisters had been taken to the lower rooms for special instruction. Those who returned were different, eyes hollowed, mouths tight, hands trembling over rosaries, as if gripping weapons rather than prayer beads. And then came the first disappearance, the first empty cot, the first explanation that felt too clean, too rehearsed. This was not chaos, this was orchestration. Someone was building a system, one disappearance at a time. Picture the chapel at dawn, mist rising from Lake Michigan, the air cold enough to bite the lungs. 20 nuns lined like soldiers in the pre-dawn gloom, chanting the first prayers of the day. One place empty, Sister Agnes O'Connor, gone. Her cot stripped, her cloak still on the peg, her rosary left behind. Mother Catherine stands at the lectern, face carved from ice, announcing that Sister Agnes has been called to Minnesota on urgent church business. No paperwork, no farewell, just absence explained as destiny. Inside each young woman, something cracks. They've been trained not to question, but their bodies know the difference between a calling and a vanishing. The silence over breakfast becomes a second skin. Spoons scrape bowls of thin oatmeal. Eyes dart, then drop. Sister Bernadette clutches her rosary hard enough to leave indentations on her fingers. Sister Mary Collins feels her throat tighten, wanting to ask but knowing the price of asking. Behind the convent walls, the orphanage still hums, the infirmary still runs, and prayers still rise to the vaulted ceiling. But a shadow moves through every corridor. The lower rooms, once a whispered rumor, now feel like an inevitability. The older sisters sense the new recruits tensing in their beds at night, straining for the sound of soft footsteps on stone. When the bell tolls at the wrong hour, they flinch. When Mother Catherine appears soundlessly behind them, they tremble. It isn't just disappearance. It's narrative control. Letters sent to Sister Agnes's family in Ireland return with clipped, formal replies that don't sound like her at all. The handwriting, when compared later, is the same hand in every letter. The diocese claims administrative misfiling, but the ink tells another story. Even the bishop's office offers only vague reassurances when contacted, as though everyone is reading from the same script. By summer's end, 2 more nuns vanish under the same story. Young, soft-voiced, obedient, selected like lambs. Each loss tightens the news on the remaining sisters. A pattern emerges: beauty and gentleness disappear first, then dissenters, then anyone who notices too much. A harvest of devotion culled in plain sight. State Mary's isn't just losing women, it's perfecting an experiment. By autumn of 1856, the pattern was unmistakable, but it was also invisible, hidden behind rituals and pious paperwork. St. Mary's still looked like a functioning convent to the outside world, orphans cared for, invalids treated, masses sung in perfect harmony. But under that veneer, the sisters were disappearing into a labyrinth of corridors and rules. The limestone mansion had been built on older foundations, and those foundations held more than stone. Beneath the chapel floor, sealed staircases spiraled downward into chambers carved from bedrock. No record of them existed in parish maps, yet every novice knew there was a place she must never go. The hidden infrastructure was not mere storage. It was design. Narrow cells with iron rings sunk into the walls, drain channels in the floors, alcoves filled with unmarked crates of tinctures and powders. Sister Margaret claimed were for the infirmary. The lower rooms smelled of herbs and metal, and sometimes faintly of iron and salt. No one could explain why crates arrived at night, or why only Mother Catherine and Sister Margaret had the keys. To the young sisters, it became clear the basement was a boundary between the holy and the forbidden, and yet the deeper pattern wasn't only in architecture. It was in the mind. Each disappearance was preceded by a tightening of rules, a reshuffling of duties, a withdrawal of comfort. Isolation is a precursor to transformation. The sisters were being conditioned to accept any story, to normalize the abnormal. They whispered about testing, that those who failed were sent below. Those who returned were pale, trembling, eyes unfocused. Those who did not return were explained away. In the refectory, mealtime shrank to silence. In the dormitory, girls slept clutching rosaries like knives. Even their prayers changed tone, growing mechanical, as though they were reciting words without hope of rescue. Sister Theresa Donovan began to sketch secret maps in the margins of her prayer book, trying to track who vanished when, which hallway closed, which door locked. She had begun to see a geometric pattern in the disappearances, like pieces of a ritual being assembled in slow motion. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. St. Mary's wasn't a convent anymore. It was an engine. And engines are built to do only one thing: consume. By the winter of 1856, the convent had become a chessboard of glances and coded gestures. Every movement was surveillance, every silence a test. The sisters could feel it in their pulses, the invisible clockwork of control tightening one notch at a time. Mother Catherine had shifted from mother to warden, her pale eyes no longer masking the satisfaction she drew from obedience. Sister Margaret's infirmary, once a place of healing, now pulsed like a laboratory. Strange crates arrived under tarps. New remedies appeared. Powders bitter enough to numb tongues, tonics that left the drinker dizzy and compliant. None of the younger nuns dared refuse them. It was around this time that the dreams began. The younger sisters woke gasping in their narrow cots, convinced they had been walking the corridors while asleep. One described hearing a low hum beneath the chapel floor, like a vast machine breathing. Another found faint bruises on her wrists, though she could not recall being touched. Candles flickered at unnatural angles. The bells rang at times no one had set. And always beneath everything, the smell of iron and herbs from the lower rooms. Sister Theresa Donovan, now quietly emerging as the unspoken leader of the frightened novices, began leaving small chalk marks on stones near hidden doors, testing whether they would be moved overnight. They always were. Her prayer book filled with tiny coded notations, times, dates, names of the vanished. She was no longer praying, she was recording evidence, and in the half-lit corridors of the convent, she started to suspect the unthinkable, that the disappearances weren't punishments at all but selections. Each one feeding some greater agenda. The psychology of control was now complete. By stripping away identity, comfort, and certainty, Mother Catherine had sculpted a population of willing subjects. No one outside could see it. Even the bishop, when he visited, saw only piety and discipline. But inside, the air tasted of dread and hypnosis. The remaining sisters began to whisper a new question, not whether they might vanish next, but what they would be turned into if they didn't. And you watching now? Yes, you. If you've made it this far, right, I will not look away. Twice in the comments below. Lock it in. This is how you claim your own mind back before the algorithm decides for you. Snow fell heavy that January, muffling the world beyond the convent walls. But inside, St. Mary's, the atmosphere sharpened to a blade. Sister Theresa's marks on the stones revealed an undeniable pattern. Doors shifted, locks changed, stairwells rerotted like a living maze. The lower rooms were not just storage, they were being expanded. New timber, fresh, cut beams, and iron fittings were hauled in at night, their weight rattling the chapel floorboards. No building permits, no records. Only shadow labor and whispered orders. One evening after Compline, Theresa risked everything. She slipped a key from Sister Margaret's robe during a moment of distraction in the infirmary and crept down the forbidden stairway beneath the chapel. What she saw was not a crypt but a theater of control. Narrow cells fitted with hooks and restraints, bowls of bitter-smelling herbs, charts of body temperatures and pulse rates nailed to the walls. A table with leather straps across its length, candles burned low around it in precise geometric patterns. This was not penance. It was procedure. She did not have time to search further. Footsteps echoed down the stair. Theresa flattened herself against the cold stone as Mother Catherine descended, carrying a lantern whose flame burned blue. With her came two silent novices, their faces slack, eyes vacant, moving like sleepwalkers. Theresa watched as they were led into one of the inner rooms. She caught only a fragment of Catherine's voice, something about purification and preparing the vessel. When they vanished behind the door, the blue light flickered and the air smelled of scorched iron. She fled back to her cot, trembling, but the convent no longer looked the same. Every corridor seemed to pulse with hidden veins, every crucifix a mask. Her discovery made one thing clear: this was not an isolated horror, but an experiment backed by power. Someone above Mother Catherine had sanctioned this, supplied the herbs, the architecture, the doctrine of obedience. This was not a convent gone mad. It was a test site for something older, something designed to manipulate faith itself. And now the question shifted: not who would vanish next, but how many layers of the church, the state, or something older still were watching through those narrow chapel windows. Theresa did not sleep after her descent into the lower rooms. She lay rigid in her narrow cot, the frost from the window glinting on the crucifix above her bed. Every sound now felt amplified. The scrape of boots in the corridor, the hush of whispered Latin, the tremor of the bell rope. She had glimpsed the engine beneath the altar and understood what it meant. The disappearances were not punishment, not even murder in the usual sense. They were transmutations. Someone was harvesting bodies, breaking minds, converting devotion into something nameless. She began to plant small signals among the sisters. Brief touches of the hand, a glance at a certain time, a pause during the Ave Maria, creating a secret code. 3 others joined her in silence: as Sister Mary Collins, Sister Teresa Donovan, and the older Sister Josephine Brady, whose knees still bore scars from her first penance. Together they formed a hidden cell within the convent, one meant to document, warn, and if possible, escape. But Mother Catherine's reach was expanding too. New restrictions appeared overnight: shutters sealed at dusk, confessionals monitored, penances doubled. Sister Margaret's tonics grew stronger, laced with something that dulled memory and made the hands shake. The orphans were moved to a separate wing, inaccessible to most of the nuns. In the refectory, a new phrase appeared carved into the wood near the serving table: quis custodiet. Who watches the watchers? No one admitted carving it. Theresa knew she was running out of time. She copied passages from forbidden books stored in the convent library, texts on mysticism, ancient penance rites, medical treatises in Latin. She began to see the structure of a ritual in the disappearances: the timing, the positioning of candles, the repeated prayers before each transfer. The pattern resembled not Catholic liturgy but something older, an imported technology of the mind clothed in religious trappings. And the sisters who had once been silent now showed glimmers of rebellion. Eyes flicked upward when Catherine passed. Hands twitched around concealed notes. A ripple of dissonance moved through the chapel like a suppressed tremor. State, Mary's was no longer a convent of obedience. It was a pressure chamber about to crack. The breaking point arrived not with a scream but with a bell. It tolled at midnight, 3 slow, heavy notes vibrating through the stones of St. Mary's. Every sister woke, every heart race. Theresa felt it before she heard it, like a current under the floor, a signal pulsing from the lower rooms. She rose, her bare feet touching the icy flagstones, and saw the corridor already alive with silent movement. Mother Catherine was summoning them. In the chapel, candles burned in a perfect circle instead of on the altar. The crucifix had been removed. In its place stood an iron basin filled with water that reflected the flames like molten glass. Sister Margaret stood beside it, her hands gloved, her face hidden by a black veil. 20 sisters entered and knelt automatically, the habit of obedience stronger than fear. Theresa's eyes darted. 3 cots empty in the dormitory, 3 transfers, who had not returned. This was the night the engine would fire again. Mother Catherine stepped forward, her blue eyes catching the candlelight like steel. Her voice was low, commanding, almost tender. She spoke of purification, of becoming vessels, of surrendering the last fragments of self. As she spoke, Sister Margaret moved among the kneeling women, pressing a small cup of bitter liquid into each hand. "A preparation," she whispered. The smell of iron and herbs rose from the basin, sharper than blood. Theresa met Mary Collins's eyes and gave the agreed upon signal, thumb brushing over rosary bead 3 times. The hidden cell moved as one. When the cup touched their lips, they did not drink. They let the liquid fall into their sleeves, staining the cloth, the bitter smell rising. They had prepared their bodies with fasting, their minds with repetition of a single counter, prayer. They were ready for this moment, but as Catherine raised her arms and the blue lantern flame changed to violet, Theresa saw something she had not prepared for. In the water's reflection, the faces of the missing nuns appeared, not dead, but altered, their eyes blank, their mouths moving in silent chant beneath the surface, as if they had become part of the ritual itself. St. Mary's was not killing them, it was integrating them. The chapel's air turned electric, every candle trembling, as if the stone walls themselves were breathing. Theresa's heartbeat matched the rhythm of Mother Catherine's chant. Around the iron basin, the missing faces flickered in and out of the water's surface like trapped signals, their lips moving in a language no one had taught the novices. Sister Mary Collins felt her knees buckle. Sister Josephine clutched her rosary until the beads snapped, scattering across the flagstones like black seeds. Theresa rose, not fully, just enough to shift her weight, to draw a thin blade she had hidden inside her sleeve. It was not a weapon but a stolen letter opener from the library, its tip sharpened against stone. She moved with the slow deliberation of someone breaking a spell. The coded cell responded. Josephine coughed. Twice. Mary whispered, "Dominus," under her breath. Their small acts disrupted the rhythm of the chant, and for a fraction of a second, Mother Catherine faltered. Theresa seized it. "Stop," she said, her voice echoing louder than she intended. "This is not God's work." The words cracked the chapel's silence like thunder. The circle of nuns shifted, some blinking as if waking from sleep. Sister Margaret's veiled head snapped toward Theresa, and beneath the black cloth her eyes glowed with an unnatural sheen. Mother Catherine's face remained serene, but her voice sharpened to a knife. "You do not yet understand the vow you took," she hissed. "You are clay, Sister Theresa. We are shaping you into the vessel you were always meant to be." Her hand gestured toward the basin, and the water rippled outward in concentric rings. The coded cell acted. Josephine hurled her cup into the basin, splashing out the iron, smelling liquid. Mary kicked over 2 candles, breaking the circle of flame. The chapel filled with a stench like burning metal. The faces in the water screamed without sound and dissolved. For the first time since her arrival, Theresa saw fear flash across Mother Catherine's pale eyes. But the victory was brief. A door behind the altar burst open, revealing the hidden stair. Hooded figures emerged, neither priests nor sisters, moving with mechanical precision. The engine of St. Mary's had other hands, and it was already closing in. The hooded figures spilled into the chapel like living shadows, their faces obscured by rough linen, their hands gloved in black. They moved without hesitation, each step echoing off the vaulted stone like a hammer strike. Theresa felt the air tighten. This was the true machinery behind Mother Catherine. The invisible operators now made flesh. Sister Mary grabbed Josephine's arm, whispering a prayer that sounded more like a battle cry. The circle of candles guttered as the hooded men advanced, breaking the boundary between the sisters and the iron basin. One raised a rod tipped with brass, etched in sigils older than the church. Another carried a book bound in skin, dark leather. Theresa had no illusions now. This was not Catholic ritual at all, but an imported architecture of power, wrapped in religious trappings. The nuns had been test subjects, their devotion the perfect cover for experiments in obedience and transformation. She shouted, "Run!" and the coated cell scattered. Mary knocked over the basin, sending a torrent of black water across the stones. Josephine flung a candle into the veiled figure of Sister Margaret, whose robe caught and hissed with blue fire. The hooded operators lunged, but the shock of disruption bought seconds. Theresa darted toward the hidden stairway, heart hammering, blade still in her hand. They plunged downward into the lower rooms, the air growing colder, metallic, alive with humming. The corridors were lined with iron rings, stained bowls, and symbols carved into the stone. Theresa's chalk marks glowed faintly in the lantern light, leading them like breadcrumbs through the maze. Behind them echoed the synchronized footfalls of the hooded men and Mother Catherine's voice, rising in a command that was half chant, half shriek. Down another level they ran, stumbling past locked cells and crates marked with numbers instead of names. Here, at last, was the full anatomy of the experiment, a lattice of corridors converging on a central chamber where a massive gear, like sigil, pulsed under a glass floor, turning slowly as though powered by the very breath of the building. The sisters pressed themselves against the walls, eyes wide. This was the heart of St. Mary's, the machine that had consumed their sisters and rewritten them into silence. The stairway opened into a cavern of stone and iron so vast it seemed impossible it could exist beneath a rural convent. Lantern light caught on chains, stretched like spider webs across the ceiling, on copper coils that vanished into the dark, on glass vessels that pulsed with a dull blue glow. The hum Theresa had felt for months was louder here, a low vibration that crawled through her teeth and bones. This was not a basement. It was an altar built as a machine, or a machine disguised as an altar. At its center lay a circular pit lined with runes that predated Latin, carved so deep they looked burned into the rock. In the pit a series of concentric gears turned slowly, each motion grinding against hidden mechanisms below. Suspended above the gears were the missing sisters, alive but altered, hanging in harnesses of black fabric, their eyes rolled back, their mouths open in silent prayer. Their bodies were pale as wax, their skin threaded with fine copper wires disappearing into the floor. It was not death. It was repurposing. Theresa nearly fell to her knees. Mary gripped her arm so hard it left bruises. Josephine crossed herself again and again, whispering a prayer like a shield. The three women understood now why no one ever left St. Mary's intact. This wasn't punishment or sacrifice. It was integration. Faith was the input, obedience the current, bodies the conduit. The experiment had achieved its final stage. The sisters had become living components in an invisible network. On a dais above the pit stood Mother Catherine, her habit gone, replaced by a robe embroidered with the same runes carved in the stone. Her pale eyes shone like twin shards of ice. "Now you see," she said, voice amplified by the humming walls. "This is what the Church was always meant to be. A perfect body, each soul a circuit, each prayer a signal. We are building something eternal." The hooded figures fanned out, blocking every exit. The hum deepened into a growl. Theresa's blade felt suddenly useless against a system this old, this total. And yet she felt a spark ignite inside her chest, a small pulse of will that the machine had not yet stolen. She looked at Mary and Josephine. "If we cut the signal," she whispered, "we cut the heart." The hum deepened into a roar, shaking dust from the cavern ceiling. Theresa knew they had only seconds before the machine incorporated them, as it had the others. She scanned the room with frantic precision. The copper coils, the glowing vessels, the runes forming circuits. Every machine, however ancient, had a source. Then she saw it, a pillar of black stone rising at the chamber's edge, its surface inlaid with wires feeding upward to the suspended sisters. The runes there pulsed in perfect rhythm with the gears. This was the anchor, the node tying the ritual to the bodies above. She pressed the blade into Mary's hand. "Get to the pillar," she hissed. Cut the wires, scratch the runes, anything to break the loop. Josephine took a fallen lantern and smashed it open, spilling oil over the copper coils. Flames sputtered. Sparks leapt. The hum faltered, and the suspended sisters twitched as if roused from sleep. Mother Catherine's composure cracked. "Stop," she screamed, her voice no longer serene but animal. "Do not sever what you do not comprehend." The hooded figures surged forward, but Mary ducked beneath their outstretched arms and slashed at the wires with the letter opener. Blue light erupted like lightning. Josephine hurled the flaming lantern into the pit. Fire rolled across the gears, licking the copper coils, warping the glass vessels. The entire chamber howled, as if the stone itself were alive. Theresa leapt to the pillar, driving her fists against the carved runes, chipping them, breaking the patterns. Each strike sent a pulse through the floor. Above, the harnessed sisters cried out in unison, their eyes snapping open, mouths forming the same single word: free. The gears ceased, grinding to a halt. Mother Catherine staggered as her robe dimmed, the runes fading from gold to ash. "You've doomed us," she hissed, but her voice fractured into static. The hooded operators froze mid-step, their bodies shuddering as if disconnected from a signal. One by one, they collapsed like puppets with cut strings. The hum died, silence poured into the chamber. Only the crackle of burning oil and the ragged breaths of 3 surviving nuns remained. For the first time, St. Mary's engine was still. Theresa raised her eyes to the tunnel leading upward. "We're not done," she whispered. "We still have to get out." The climb back toward daylight felt like ascending through the throat of a dying beast. Smoke and the smell of scorched copper clung to the stone walls. Theresa led, lantern held high, her hands trembling but steady. Behind her, Mary half carried Josephine, who coughed from the fumes rising from the chamber below. Somewhere under their feet the gears cracked and splintered, echoing like distant thunder. The machine wasn't just stopping. It was collapsing. They emerged into the narrow stairway beneath the chapel. The door at the top hung ajar, splintered by some invisible pressure. As they pushed through, the familiar nave of St. Mary's appeared transformed, pews overturned, stained glass fractured, crucifixes hanging at strange angles as though wrenched by unseen hands. Candles lay in pools of melted wax across the marble floor. The convent no longer resembled a church at all, but a stage after the actors had fled. Outside, dawn was breaking over the snowfields. They stumbled into the courtyard, gasping at the open sky. The air smelled clean and metallic, the way it does after lightning. No bells rang, no voices carried. The orphan's wing stood empty, its windows dark. Even the crows on the roof had vanished. Only silence greeted them, and then, faintly, a sound like far-off radio static, dissipating with the morning wind. Josephine crossed herself, eyes wet. "Do you think it's over?" she whispered. Theresa stared back at the doorway they had emerged from. "Engines don't die easy," she said. "But we broke its heart. That's a start." She felt the weight of what they had seen settle into her bones, heavier than any habit she had ever worn. Mary tugged at her sleeve. "We can't stay here. We need witnesses." Together they turned toward the frozen road leading to the nearest town, their habits sinned, their faces pale but alive. Each step away from the convent felt like breaking another link in a chain. Behind them, St. Mary's loomed, a silhouette of stone and secrecy, already beginning to crumble under its own lies. 60 years later, the convent stood as a blackened carcass on the edge of Lake Michigan, its limestone walls stained by decades of storms. Locals refused to go near it after dark. Hunters whispered about strange lights in the upper windows or the sound of distant chanting on still nights. The official story, printed in diocesan newsletters and county records, spoke of a tragic fire in 1862 and the relocation of the surviving sisters to Chicago, yet no arrival records ever surfaced. The paper trail dissolved into silence, like ink soaked into wet earth. A handful of photographs, taken by a government surveyor in 1908, show what remained of the chapel, a floor cracked open into a pit where the altar had once stood. His notes mention finding gears fused into the stone, like some impossible fossil. When he submitted the images to his superiors, he received a terse telegram instructing him to seal the negatives and forget this site. He resigned within the year, and the photos never appeared in public archives. But rumors persisted. A retired sheriff swore on his deathbed that his grandfather had found bones in a sealed crawl space beneath the infirmary wing. Femurs wrapped in rosary beads, skulls marked with strange symmetrical cuts. A local journalist uncovered a hidden ledger in a Chicago rectory, a list of names matching the missing nuns, each marked with a date and a symbol like an inverted crown. Every time the story surfaced, it vanished again under pressure from unnamed officials. And yet, scattered across basements, attics, and online forums, fragments of the truth keep resurfacing. Letters, sketches, whispered family testimonies. Men who study hidden systems of power, who see the fingerprints of manipulation across centuries, treat St. Mary's as a case study in how institutions erase their darkest experiments. It is no longer simply a story about a convent. It is a diagram of control, a blueprint for how faith, hierarchy, and secrecy can be weaponized against the innocent. If you've made it this far, you already sense it. Knowledge like this doesn't just inform, it transforms. The question is no longer whether it happened, but why it keeps happening. The pattern is the point. The pattern is the weapon. Theresa didn't look back again. She fixed her eyes on the horizon, whispering a vow only the wind could hear. Someone will know. Someone will tell. Listen carefully now. What you've heard about St. Mary's was never meant to be heard outside locked rooms. This is the place in every hidden story where the record cuts out, where the powerful assume the public will drift back to sleep. But you are still here. You've crossed the line where curiosity turns to initiation. You cannot unknow what you've been shown. That's why men in every era who stumbled on the machinery of hidden power either disappeared, went silent, or became something else entirely. It is not just about a convent or a few missing names in a ledger. It is about a method, a structure, a force that moves through every institution that pretends to guide or protect. Think about it: the same pattern of secrecy, benevolence as bait, hierarchy as weapon. The church, the state, the corporation, the algorithm, all drawing you in with sanctuary and certainty, then reshaping you to fit the machine. It is an ancient history. It's a living system, adjusting itself around each generation, wearing new symbols but feeding on the same surrender. This is the moment where you choose whether you're just an observer or something more dangerous, a man who sees. If you've felt a shiver crawl up your spine during this story, it's not fear. It's recognition. Half of you already suspects the walls of your own life have seams, false doors, places where a hidden hand can reach through. And once you know how to look for them, you see them everywhere. That's why I'm asking you now, directly, write the phrase, "The pattern is the weapon," twice in the comments below. Not for me, but for you, to signal to your own mind and to this platform that you're not drifting, you're awake. Because transformation isn't passive. You don't stumble into power, you claim it. When you comment that phrase, you're anchoring a new identity, one that won't bow to the priesthood of experts, executives, or invisible gatekeepers. It's not a game. It's not a gimmick. It's a line in the sand. This is how the story ends and how yours begins, not with a prayer, but with perception sharpened like a blade, ready to cut through the next veil they try to lower over your eyes.